Good morning. We are up to Chapter 6, Gender in Sports. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 are covering some more polarizing topics, and many of us are going to have differing viewpoints, and that's perfectly fine. But as I always say, going into a semester, we need to approach topics with an open mind and really be respectful of everyone's viewpoints. So let's kind of jump in. Just as some overview for the next or for this chapter, a key word here for this chapter, chapter 6 and chapter 7, is hegemony. And essentially, this is dominance over of one particular group over another group, and typically, or at least the way we're viewing this is from a social perspective, a social group. So, obviously, right now we're talking about males dominating over females. What we should kind of recognize from this chapter is that there has been major progress, specifically over the last 50 years, give or take, and we should absolutely appreciate that. Societal changes take a long time. It's not like there's just kind of these one tipping point acts that everything changes and we just flip a switch. It really requires a shift in our overall thinking and an evolution. So despite this progress, there are still societal undertones that have not fully been changed. Your text also kind of outlines the topics and the differences between women in sport versus gender issues in sport, which the first one really looks at participation and equal rights, and that's really what the majority of this chapter is about, versus gender identity and their roles in sports. If at any point I speak kind of in a manner that some of you might find disrespectful, I apologize, but I do think that's not my intention at all, but I do think it's important that we kind of start having these conversations. If any of you are in my kinesiology class, you know how I feel about it. If we're going to continue to kind of push for equal rights, if we're going to push the evolution of sports and society, these conversations have to be had. And sometimes I am stuck in my ways of how I speak about things. I try to be mindful, but occasionally, again, we are kind of all raised up a certain way, and if I ever do something like gender mark a specific sport, right, it's never intentional, just kind of the way I was raised up. So you guys will see that in a second. So first, let's talk about history. So your text outlines 3 distinct time frames for women's sports. The first one runs from 1896 to 1928, and for the most part, this was just pure exclusion and dismissal of women's sports, where women's sports didn't really exist in any notable form. From there, in 1928 to about 1952, during this middle period, there was quote-unquote feminine appropriate sports, which received a little bit of attention, but again, nothing notable. And what we really saw at this time is a true gendering of sports, where some sports were more feminine appropriate than others. So an example of this is something like gymnastics being considered much more of a feminine sport and being somewhat more acceptable and viewed, versus something like basketball, which was absolutely still a male dominant sport. And while this represents a much longer time period, and there's probably many other major time frames between this, the third time frame is 1952 to present day, where we've kind of viewed women as conquering power struggles, and there has been some major shifts in what's accepted by society. So during that latter time period, that third time period, the book outlines 2 major tipping points or turning points that have increased participation and inclusion for women in sports. One of which was Title IX. Many of us have heard of Title IX. It's important to realize that Title IX was never purposely intended to be aimed at sports. right? But Title IX did have a dramatic impact on sports. So three of the bylaws of Title IX are that opportunities are provided that are proportionate to student enrollment, opportunities are expanded for the underrepresented sex, and interests of the underrepresented sex are fully satisfied. So at the university or high school level, right, a institution will have considered to have met Title IX requirements if they simply meet one of these requirements. So, you know, if a university provides enrollment proportionate to, or provides sporting opportunities proportionate to student enrollment, or they could do something like if there is no a significant interest in a sport, like, I don't know, let's say women's volleyball. If there's not an interest in women's sport, they will have met Title IX for that particular sport. And I'm probably not describing it appropriate, but you guys get the point of how Title IX is met. Just one of these three pronged bylaws will have fulfilled Title IX requirements. I think Title IX is really one of the major aspects that have increased women's sports participation. And if you look here on the right, it's actually pretty cool. And that's the nice thing about teaching classes I've never personally taught. Despite being like an avid sports fan, I didn't realize how little participation there was for women in sports in the 1970s. I mean, look at these numbers, right? 700, 450, 370 in golf. This is in 1972, and look at the numbers in 2007. I mean, it's pretty incredible how it's changed. Now it's been 50 years since 1972, but that was really just less than 40 years. So again, we have to appreciate that there has been tremendous progress from those earlier time periods. Another point in time that was very important for women's rights in sports was an event called the Battle of the Sexes, which was a 1973 tennis exhibition match between a former tennis champ, Bobby Riggs, versus women's tennis champ, Billie Jean King. Bobby Riggs argued that he could pretty much beat any female in a match of tennis at the age of 55, and Billie Jean King kind of stepped up in her prime and ended up beating Bobby Riggs. It was a major event. They played it in front of a crowd of about 30,000 people. It was on TV live, and it was a major turning point, really to kind of increase the respectability of a woman athlete. Some other historic moments. I thought this one was pretty interesting. The text didn't talk about it a tremendous amount, but obviously this one is much more recent and much more relevant. So I wanted to kind of give you guys a little bit more history. Women's soccer, I'm sure many of you guys have seen the headlines, but this is a little bit of a timeline. In 2016, 5 soccer players filed a complaint about workplace discrimination, essentially outlining that they were vastly underpaid compared to their male counterparts. And it really depends on which stat you want to take, but essentially women earned between 38 and 72% less of what men earned for like an exhibition match. If you look at what they were paid for international matches, it was probably about a third, if I remember correctly, but they were significantly underpaid. This didn't really gain any traction, so the women dropped that claim and inevitably filed a lawsuit against U.S. Soccer. And this kind of got a little bit ugly in 2020 when U.S. Soccer had a doctor testify and basically said that it was quote unquote indisputable science that essentially females were inferior to their male counterparts. And needless to say, Carlos Cordero inevitably resigned at his position. But despite this, in April 2020, the district court actually dismissed the player's argument, which was, again, a massive setback for the female players fighting for equal pay. But very much so recently in February 2022, the players had filed an appeal and they actually had settled on a $24 million settlement. And this was a major win for obviously for U.S. women's soccer, but it was a major win for female athletes. Obviously here on the bottom picture here, this is Megan Rapinoe, who is one of the leading advocates for equal pay. So again, it was a pretty cool story, and really you guys should spend some time reading about this. I'm going to link one article that gives you kind of the timeline that I based a lot of these numbers from. But it's something that I think we'll kind of refer back to again as another tipping point 10, 20, 30 years from now in terms of women's equal pay in sports. Hegemony, like I said, is the dominance usually by one social group over another. And your text I just copied and pasted this quote here. In Western countries, images of ideal masculinity are constructed and promoted most systemically through competitive sports. All right. So 5 features of masculine hegemony essentially are physical force and control, occupational achievement, patriarchy, modern outdoorsmen, and heterosexuality. Essentially, sports are more likely to show a fast break dunk than executing a spot-on assist for a timely layup. This is something that was in the text, and this is where it gets kind of interesting. And I think it gets challenging as well. I think the argument, and if we're being honest here, the argument is that male athletes are superior and more visually appealing than female athletes. That's one of the main arguments. Another argument is that male sports bring in more revenue than female sports. But this is I guess addresses the more visually appealing element. And how do we feel about this? Again, I only know what I was brought up on, what I was raised on, where our society really values physical force and impressive displays of force. I was raised I was born in 1985, and the home run race with Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds was something like I'll never forget. And again, we talk about power. That was just vastly or greatly appreciated by everyone at the time. We enjoy seeing a fast break dunk. Now, is there something that should be changed about this? I don't know, and I feel very conflicting about this. Another example could be, you could have something like a sports team who is just high flying above the rim, like I always go back to basketball for something like this, but the Clippers with Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Jordan, right? They were called Lob City. What do you appreciate watching more? Do we appreciate that type of basketball, or do we appreciate what we consider the boring San Antonio Spurs, right? And this is taking race out of that equation. Regardless, people are still going to shift towards that Lob City type of basketball as what they want to watch and consume, much more so than the fundamentals of the San Antonio Spurs. It's boring. So I what I'm trying to say in a I guess politically correct manner is that our societal undertones appreciate these physical displays of force and power much more so than fundamentals, so to speak. And I don't know if that's ever going to change. That's part of what sports is. And I highly recommend any of you guys to kind of challenge me on that. I think it's an interesting topic for discussion. Gender coverage in sports, so like what we actually see. And this is like kind of a sad number, right? Women's sports coverage represents 1 to 5% of mainstream media. This is really looking at ESPN, Fox, and Sports Illustrated, depending on which body you're looking at. So it's pretty shocking. Why is this number so bad or so low? And one of the reasons is because of lack of women viewership. And then additionally, women's sports are aired, but it's more likely to appear on like a fringe sports network. And you'll see some of these things are starting to change. I think that's on the next slide. Another thing you could see is if you look in the text, Olympics covers women's sports at a higher degree than men's sports. Now, the text does kind of outline some potential reasons for this. One being, women's sports, especially in the Summer Olympics, which gets even more attention, is it because they are in like their tight clothing and the sexualization of women's sports, but they also outline that it could potentially be because, at least for the U.S., the women's sports have been much more successful in recent years than men's sports. So, two things to kind of look at for why the Olympics in the U.S. covers more women's sports than men's. Gendered language, and this is what I was talking about, where you've got to forgive me if I do sometimes speak in this manner, but that's kind of the way it's the way I was kind of brought up, and it always comes back to societal undertones. Naming practices. So naming practices at my local high school. We are the North Rockland Red Raiders. For track and field, right? For track and fields, we call ourselves the Raiders, whatever it is. But I could say right now, my peer who coaches the girls, right? At least as the head coach, he calls them the Lady Raiders, and this really kind of implies that when you refer to just the Raiders, that you're really just speaking about the male or the boys within that sport, and that you have to add ladies to a name, and it implies that kind of the men or the males get the priority, so to speak. And that really goes hand in hand with the next one, which is gender marking. And there's a reason, I think, or at least some people have an explanation for this, but an example is the LPGA Tour, which is the Ladies Professional Golf Association. Why does it have to say ladies, just like the WNBA, right? I think, one reasonable explanation is because, men's sports have come first. So, men's basketball came before women's basketball. The PGA Tour on the men's side came before women's PGA Tour. Is this something that should be changed? I don't know. I think there's absolutely some merit, because I can see how some of this stuff can be, I think the term is denunciating, right, of female in sports. And that really comes back to another aspect of gendered language is sexual disparagement. And this is a major, major societal aspect that I think has changed. But essentially, this is stigmatizing people through the denunciation of sexual orientations. So this is just in like everyday language, using terms like gay or butch. And there's obviously much more terms. I think Kevin Durant, for instance, recently has gotten to some trouble where he used words that I wouldn't even say to other players. But things like this are societal undertones that have gotten significantly better. You are much less likely to hear people use some of these terms to describe a player and disparage a player, because again, it essentially disparages people of that orientation, whether gay, male, female, whatever it is. All right, opportunities. So there's two pictures here. There's two pictures here of two different people. How many of you guys know the person in the top right-hand corner? Okay. How many of you know the person in the bottom right-hand corner? You could say a name. I would venture a guess that the vast majority of you, at least if we're in sports, know who the person in the top right-hand corner. I want to say vast majority, but maybe half of you in this class. And I would say a lesser number of you know the person in the bottom right-hand corner. Yet, both of these people are owners of two of the most popular organizations, the most valued organizations in the entire world. So the person in the top right-hand corner is Jerry Jones. right? Jerry Jones is the owner of the Cowboys, valued at approximately nowadays, who knows, 7, 8, 9, $10 billion. It's the most valuable organization in the world. The person in the bottom right-hand corner is Jeannie Buss, owner of the Los Angeles Lakers. They're somewhere within the top 10. I'm not really sure nowadays. But again, you can start to see the point I'm trying to make in terms of female in sports. I think it's changing. I think if you are a female, I think you have to kind of recognize the changes that have been made, but also recognize that there's still a lot more work to be done, and kind of be that outspoken leader. And Jeannie Buss has done that to an extent. She's made herself this kind of media icon for the Los Angeles Lakers, and I think that's very important if we are going to continue to kind of push women's sports, women's roles in sports. Which again has had a lot of change in the last 50 years. So some trends that have been leading to more opportunities to women's sports are the active female consumer. Women are now spending much more money than they did 30, 40 years ago on sports. Female spectators, that's attending both males and female sports. Males, we also have a role in this. We have to push forward female sports. So going to women's events as a spectator is one of the ways in which we can do that. Number 4 is women's sports being accepted by mainstream media. I think probably no sport has done a better job in this than the WNBA. The WNBA has really done a great job of kind of putting them forward into the mainstream media. Maybe women's soccer, but the problem with women's soccer is it's not as popular year round, in my opinion, unless you just consume soccer. And corporations honestly are kind of seeing this, and they're really capitalizing it by selling sports to women, which is again another market opportunity if you're in the field. Despite all this, there are some career opportunity hurdles that you will end up facing. This could be verbal abuse, it could be sexual comments, and then I think a very common one is the belittling of knowledge. And as unfortunate as it sounds, women are going to have to work harder, right, to kind of earn their seat at the table. And it shouldn't be that way. It should not be that way. But until there has been a complete shift in our societal undertones, a paradigm shift, that's probably what's going to continue to happen. All right, I've had some trouble getting the audio on this, so hopefully this works for you guys. Your assignment is to read A Matter of Ethics. This section of the chapter really covers ESPN Magazine's popular body issue where athletes pose nude. But really kind of comes down to the first question is, do women who pose nude or sexualize themselves have a responsibility to other women? And it kind of comes back to basically two sides of this equation. Yes, women probably have the ability to kind of sexualize themselves, whether it's in something like Sports Illustrated or nowadays in social media, to increase their ability to earn money and revenue. And I think they absolutely can do that, right? But is it at the expense of kind of fighting for equal rights and essentially equal respect within this field? And I don't think there is a clear answer, but I would love to hear each and every one of your thoughts.